we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I want to begin with two things, and the first of them is personal. I have this great tendency to start to look and sound angry, and I apologize. One week I stopped and asked, am I sounding angry? And one of you guys said no more than usual. I think it was you. And last week I stopped and I looked at Barbara and said, am I starting to sound angry? And she. When I'm teaching or preaching, there are about 16 things going through here at the same time. I'm trying to think clock, I'm watching your eyes, I'm trying as best I can, as I know all of you, to what's going on. Above all, I'm trying to peel back the layers of my defenses and yours and get to your heart with the gospel. Furthermore, I know sometimes I'm saying things that will rattle you. That's not bad, but I have to be careful because I should not and cannot do that just for grandiosity. But I'm trying to cut through our assumptions, which are part of our idolatry. I know that because I've been through it. Furthermore, I know the issues that people are dealing with in terms of their mindset. And there are so many voices going on in our lives and our life. And not the least of which I'm up here saying to myself, did you remember to put your teeth in and zip your trousers? Or tighten your belt? And when that goes on for me, I start to look and sound angry because I'm scared. Does that help? As a mother of two, do you start to look and sound angry when you're not really? And you're just, thank you, Sarah. All right. Did I explain it okay? You've been through it for 53 years. Did I explain it okay, Todd?
I can lay my eye up on it the day if that would help.
Here's my tie. What's the matter with it?
Nothing. I said I can take my eye out and lay it on the table.
Oh, okay.
That way you don't have to look at me.
Thank you, Todd. You'll keep an eye out for us. All right. That's the first thing I need to do. So when I get that way, just stop me and say, calm down, you're fine. All right? Thank you. Thank you. All right.
That's why everybody's in this room.
Yes, amen.
Thank you.
I think I can speak for the group. Thank you, Pastor, for all you do and your direction and your delivery to us. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. Now, the second thing is, last week it was made known to me that as we moved from Ruth into 1 Samuel, I threw a lot of things at you, and it was all rapid fire. Do you need, here, would you like to ask questions from the last 2 weeks? I have an impression that one person who has been in this group has been pointedly absent for 2. And I think I unsettled the person, okay? Now, these are the things we talked about last week. It's kind of a thumbnail sketch, and it is the outline as I had it in front of me as I spoke to you. Are there particular things in that encounter that we had that you would like more information about, or would like to say, explain that more, or I'm not sure what you meant and it bothers me? We talked about the contrast between Ruth and Samuel. That's just observation between the two. I talked about the prophetic viewpoint, how the prophet is guided by the Lord to say things on the Lord's behalf using the prophet's context and experience, and he's describing an immediate situation, or she, and there are a few voices like Ruth's in her song when she describes what's going on. And it's an immediate thing. But it also describes the way the Lord operates up to Christ. But when has the Lord stopped operating? So is he still, part of what's going on is that the Lord is saying, here are these everyday people, Ruth and Boaz, as an example, in their everyday circumstance, facing their humanity, their promises, their hopes, their dreams. And here's how I operated there. Are you like Ruth and Boaz? Are Ruth and Boaz like you? That's why 2 weeks ago I tried to make them so entirely everyday. Because they are. The same as you and I struggle with everything and wonder. If we put Ruth and Boaz up on some stage and, oh, we gotta be, is that who you are every day? I'm not. I'm living with these doubts and misgivings and brokenness. Roger asked about this last week. That's the one question that got in. Thank you. Because Roger made the question, but we sin every day. Yeah, and the real issue is not just our deeds, everybody. We are self-centered and we see things from my viewpoint. Things that I think are to my advantage or disadvantage, my hopes, my needs, my rebellions, things that have happened to me or haven't happened to me, sad or whatever. And I'm saying, God, are you in the middle of this? Have you left me alone? What I just said should sound familiar because that's really what a lot of the Psalms say. And if the Psalms are saying it, then that's who we are. The one thing that's consistent is the grace of God and the sinfulness of human being. And sinfulness is not wrongdoing. It is the brokenness inside us that we are not God and we're trying to play God in our own life. And God said, these are my people. Ruth and Boaz trying to be devout, and we're not sure whatever else happened that we would or wouldn't approve of. And now we're going to get to 1 Samuel. That's the prophet's perspective. I spoke about this phrase that one or two of you, a good friend of mine said, boy, he hadn't thought about this in some time. The faith which we believe, which is, and the faith by which we believe. That's here. Just saying, this is our faith, and say this information to my head, and then expect my head to apply it to my heart and straighten it out. That is a powerful, subtle idolatry. There were times when I was a kid learning to ride my bike, and I'd lose control, hit a chuck hole, get thrown off the thing, skin my elbow terribly or my knee. I'd come running home, blood everywhere, gravel in my elbow or knee. Mom, I hurt myself. My mother's, come here and let me look at it. No, leave it alone, you're going to hurt me. My mother would say, yes, I am. We got to clean that out or it's going to get more infected. Oh, good, that's the fun part when I get to pick at the scab. No. Joke. All right. My mother had to doctor my wound. I couldn't do it myself. Ministry happens when I peel back from you the way you would like us all to see you, or the way you would like God to see you, how well you got it handled. When I peel that back gently and I put my finger on the hurt, your humanity, and then I put the balm of the gospel on it. The same thing happens when Michael or Luke or Jeff or Aaron, Paul, any of our guys who are upset, who peel back. Bill, this morning, is doing it. But the scary thing about that is, I have to get in front of you and tell you why I sound angry. Because I'm insecure. Because I want your approval. Thank you. You know. Because I'm afraid I don't fit in. Because I'm afraid you're going to see all I am as a sinner. I said to somebody one time, I'd hurt their feelings. I hate it when I hurt somebody's, and I had apologized. And I just was reiterating my apology. Don't you know God has forgiven you? I said, yeah, I know that. I just detest it, and I punish myself. And they said, do you think you're bigger than God? I said, yes, sometimes. You ever go through that? Thank you, Tad, for your honesty. The best thing I am, the best thing any of you will be, is a human being. And that means we are sinners under grace. The Lutheran confessions say, because the scriptures say it, the ultimate problem is I'm self-centered, which means I see things only from my perspective, and I think I can manipulate and control and fix the world. No, I can't. That's God's job, and it includes me. And he does it with the message of the gospel. Fear not, I am with you. God, as we know him, understands this because he became one of us, and he knows what it's like to be scared. And he knows what it's like to be tempted to play God, which is a whole 6-week Bible study in itself. Because Christ went through it, he understands. And the book of Hebrews says that. He was in every way, just like you and I are. But he lived in faith. I cannot create my own faith. We say that in the Catechism. I believe that I cannot, by my own reason or understanding or willpower, believe in Jesus Christ or come to him. But the Holy Spirit calls me by the gospel. And that process, because faith is constantly being created. It's never just a one-time thing. Just because you've been through confirmation class does not mean you have faith today. Doesn't even mean you had faith then. All it meant was you could answer a bunch of questions and you didn't miss class. That's all it meant. Faith is here, and it's constantly going up and down. because human beings are constantly changing. Constant. The only thing that doesn't change is our God's love for us. So we have this piled up history of which Samuel will be a piece. We saw a piece of that last week because we have Hannah coming childless. That's not an unfamiliar story. It reaches back to Leah and Rachel. It reaches back to the parents of Samson. It reaches back to Tamar and Judah. It reaches forward to Elizabeth and Zechariah. It reaches back to Sarah and Abraham. And so you have God intruding in history. Now, God's in that history all the time, which means the Lord is in our history now. This is the theater where he lives and moves and plays out his drama. The same God who operated in these very human situations then of economics and politics and society and culture is operating today in your life and mine. It's just not obvious. What the Lord does in the scriptures, we cry out, "Where are you, God? Are you there? What are you doing?" He said, come here. I want you to look over my shoulder, and I'm going to tell you what I did in the lives of these people here, which, if it would be written today by Reuters or by the Associated Press, would sound just like today. But the Lord is giving us the way, what he was really doing behind the scenes. And so he's still operating today. That's the comfort. That's the whole message of the book of Revelation. And he's not going to let us in on how the story ends, except that we know it started in Easter. We looked at types of covenant. This seemed to really jump out at some of you. Am I right? Suzerainty and parity covenants. Do any of you want to ask about that? Because there are really two kinds of covenants in the Old Testament. It's not consistent. It's not developmental. There's no covenant with Adam. You know, we got some of our fellow Christians who are very big on this notion that there was a covenant here, and then that came to an end, and then there was a covenant, that was Adam, and then with Noah, and then with Abraham, and this all develops until now we're in the final. No, it's the same God operating in larger deals. Furthermore, some of these covenants are very different. The promise he made to Abraham, we think, in the minds of many, justifies the Jewish people coming and taking over all of geographical Canaan today. Now, that's a decision by the nations of the world to say the Jewish people deserve a homeland. And it's still legally contested. I checked it out this morning. Excuse me. By the way, there was a revolt by the Jewish people in the year 135 AD. By this time, the Romans had really had it with them, and so the Romans sent in an enormous amount of troops and cleared all the Jewish people out of what had been called the province of Judah. They destroyed everything. This is the second time. It's called the Bar Kokhba revolt. It's after the destruction of the temple. And they scattered the Jews. And they wiped it off the map so that they even renamed the section of the Roman Empire that used to be called Judah. They renamed it. And they said, what will really rankle the Jews? Oh, if we call it after the name of their ancient enemies, the Philistines. And so the Romans said, this is now Palestine. That's where that comes from. So the Jews today are fighting the Philistines. What's new? You want more comment on this covenant? The covenant that you and I have in baptism with the Lord is a suzerainty covenant. He has conquered our enemy and laid claim to us. We are the booty of war. I am the Lord your God. I brought you out of the land of slavery to sin by giving my son. Therefore, you are mine. Because of that, you shall have no other gods before me, etc. We spoke and will speak today about the offices of Samuel and at some length about the political change. I've spoken about the Philistines. The Ark of the Covenant becomes it's not magical. It's a symbol. It's almost sacramental. In the same way that you and I eat and drink bread and wine and receive the affirmation of God's covenant. The Ark served a similar piece. Questions, observation? Helpful reminder? I know I threw a lot of things at you last week. Here's why we're doing this, to become more familiar with these persons and events and the theology in the early kingship. And this was my goal, especially here in this first 25 minutes, to strengthen our confidence in the purposes and actions of the Lord of history. And to see the link between the actions of the Lord in history. That's why we're trying to do this and why I'm speaking the way that I do. And again, we need to move into 1 Samuel 1 today. This I just put up for review. It's a reminder to invite you to see there are persons in this narrative and there are convictions. And some of this we're not sure of because it depends on who wrote it and when it was written and to what audience. In preparation, one of the things I did, there's a section in the book of Deuteronomy that as we move from the governorship of the judges into a king, there's a whole section in the book of Deuteronomy that talks about when you come into the land I'm going to give you and you ask for a king. Here are the restrictions. One of the other sections that's right around that, he said, because the Ammonites and the Moabites opposed you when you were coming into the land, you were not to marry them. And if somebody marries a Moabite, their descendants cannot be a member of Israel until the 10th generation. Boaz married Ruth, who was and they begat Obed, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David the king. How many generations? And if we take the number 10, meaning all of it, says a descendant of a Moabite can never be a member of Israel, and yet the Lord chooses David to become the king. Now, how do you make that agree? I don't know. And I don't know that it's necessary. What are the assumptions we are bringing to this? And I spoke about that already when I talked about trying to recognize the backgrounds of each of you as best I know them. And knowing I'm going to bump up against things, you've got to ask questions or I won't now. Please, okay? All right, and then some of the background issues. All right, here's a reminder from work we did weeks ago, because we're going to move into this as we encounter the stories of Samuel and David and Saul and David. You and I live in two realms. They are both under the control of the Lord. Those two realms are nature, which is our everyday material physical setting. Includes all, and we live in history. We are not lifted out of history. We don't live in a private history. It's very public. We live in two kingdoms within that history. The church, which is invisible. It is only in our hearts, and the state. Under church and state, at the same time, there are three orders. There's church, the visible, state, and family. And we are free to order some of this stuff right here, church, state, and family, as we see fit. Our family can make different decisions than yours. There's no preordained way that has to be. Now, what are the possible types of governance? Because one of the big issues in 1 Samuel, and one of the issues you and I are struggling with in our current day culture and society, what are the possible types of governance that have been tried in the world? Well, there's anarchy, which is no government. There is theocracy, which is government by God through religious leaders. This happens, for example, in our nation, in Utah, where the Latter-day Saints have. If you're not part of that, and there are different rules and laws and culture that apply out there. The other place it is existing is in the strictly Muslim countries, like Iran. That's a theocracy. Democracy is a third approach to how to govern, and that's government by the people. There is monarchy, and we're going to see the emergence of that in 1 Samuel, obviously government by one person. Then there's oligarchy or aristocracy, which is government by a few persons. There is republic, which is different than democracy. That's government by and through elected persons. By the way, that's our form of government in the United States. We do not live in a democracy. We do not live in a democracy. We live in a representative republic. There's a difference in the way it operates. Then there is communism, which is essentially all property is owned by all people, ideally. It's ideal. And then there's socialism, where all property is owned and run by the state. Prime example of that is Nazi Germany. It was a socialist state. All the big industries were owned by the government, essentially. And the owners, the leaders had to follow what the government wanted done. And then finally is a confederation, where local governing abides and we designate some authority and power to a central authority. Think of the Confederate States of America. And think of the colonies before we signed the Constitution. That was a confederation. If you read the book of Judges, you're reading the story of a confederation. And one of the difficulties with a confederation, although it honors local control, You cannot act in concert. And you're dealing with the power and authority of other groups. Government has three functions: to create laws and rules, to enforce the decisions and make sure it happens, and then to judge in disputes. And all these forms of government seek to do that, with the exception of anarchy, where there is no law. That's the rule of the strongest. I want you to look, there are three functions of governance: creation of laws and rules, execution of them, and judging in disputes. That's, we think immediately, city government downtown, state government downtown, national government in Washington. In what way is the creation, execution, and judging of disputes also true of the family and the local congregation? Don't you make and execute laws and rules in your home? I mean, Lonnie, when you were a young married couple, did you make the law and rule, don't overspend the checkbook? Some of which are just customs. We're going to do it this way, you know. Or we're going to, you know, here's how we're doing things. And how are we going to pursue with that? We have to remind one another, we agreed we're not doing it that way. That's judging. Is it true that this congregation has made laws and rules? Yeah, we decided to have all these different worship services. Other congregations may not give themselves that permission. Are we free to do that? But it's all human decision. And so it's open to question. Now, as we read 1 Samuel, what happens is governance is changing. During the period of the judges, God ruled his people because he had established covenant with them. And we see this in relationship between, Ruth and Boaz are prime examples of that. They're seeking to abide by the covenant. Ruth has sought to affiliate with the covenant, and Boaz is the son of the covenant. And so we see them seeking to obey the rules, and at the same time, they're facing their humanity. It is a government by God through religious leaders. There are priests at this time, the Levites, and the form of government is a confederation. Some government authority is given to the central power. So the Lord said, when you come into the land and you begin to settle these sections, appoint for yourselves judges, that when you have disputes with one another, they can settle these matters in a just way, according to my intentions and according to the care of each of you. And so we have three different kinds of law going on in the Old Testament. We have the moral law, which is epitomized by the Ten Commandments. That's not the only part of the moral law. And then we have the religious laws, like, with regard to circumcision and the sacrifices and everything else. And then we have the civil laws, which are models for how to do things. There's a huge one. It's one little sentence that just jumped out at me. Don't move the marker stone on the fields, which is essentially don't steal your neighbor's property. And we still do that today. Where's the survey mark? You're plowing my field. Now let's take a look at Deuteronomy 18, verses 14 through 20. Deuteronomy 18, verses 14 through 20. Here's the anticipation of the monarchy. Deuteronomy 18, 14 through 20. I'm reading the New International Version this morning. It says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. I apologize, I was wrong. That's wrong. Deuteronomy 17. Do you know why I wrote 18? It's because when I was creating this, I was looking at the book, and right after this, it says 18. I apologize. Thank you, Nancy. Deuteronomy 17, beginning at verse 14. Take a glance at it. Now, verse 18. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests who are Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. That's pretty core, everybody. Right there, it's talking about this matter we discuss often, that the heritage of the United States government and our culture is that of Judeo-Christian ethics. That's there. It is not because we are a Christian nation. Lutherans don't believe in that kind of thing because the church is invisible. It's in our hearts. And the notion of a Christian nation is an external thing. And another issue going on for us and for them is that you have it right here in this section that the priests hand the will of the Lord to the king. And the king is shaped by that and enforces it, which means that the government serves as a tool of the priesthood. We will see some of that because that's almost a theocracy. And we will see some of that in the story of Saul, because one of the reasons that once Saul is made king, that he is deposed, is because he's getting ready to go into battle against the Philistines. And Samuel says, wait until I get there and pray and offer sacrifice to God and dedicate the undertaking. And Saul gets either impatient or anxious or thinks Samuel's not going to arrive, so he takes it upon himself in his office as king to lead the worship. And he's no sooner done than Samuel arrives. What has happened is the king has usurped the authority, the office of Samuel, who is a prophet/priest. Two offices together. These offices that I spoke of, or orders, church, state, and family, they operate individually but in concert. But they each have their own realm of authority that the other one cannot broach. And that's part of the problem we see emerging. Let's go back to the verses I read out loud before Nancy pointed out I had the wrong chapter. Thank you again. Let's look at a couple of things in those verses. When you enter the land of the Lord your God is giving us, verse 14, and have taken possession of it and settled it, you say, let us set a king over us all like the nations around us. Is it necessarily the will of the Lord for them to have a king? No. He gives them the freedom. And he dreads it. Part of the issue we're going to see in 1 Samuel chapter 3 is where they start, we want a king, like the nations around us. And it's some of it is power, some of it is wanting to fit in, some of it is when you got a king, you can control him. You can't control if God's in charge. Okay? Altogether human. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. Did the Lord designate Saul to be king? Remember from your Bible stories. Did the Lord designate Saul to be king? Yes, Barbara, you're right. He did. Saul failed. Did the Lord pick David? Yeah. Now let's read. Do not place a foreigner over you who is not a brother Israelite. They're very careful to argue that David is a Jew. That's part of what the book of Ruth is about. It's an argument David's really Jewish. Or possibly it's raising questions about it. We don't know. The king must not acquire a great number of horses for himself. What did Solomon build at Megiddo? Do you know? Stables. Huge stables. How do you make that fit together? The Lord has told you you're not to go back. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. All right, everybody knows Solomon had what? 300 wives and 700 concubines. With just commentary on, when Solomon would make an alignment with another king, the way to seal it is that the other king would give him one of his daughters as a princess. It doesn't mean Solomon was in love with 300 women. It only means that this was the signing of the deal. How many wives did David have? About 6 of them. And some of them I asked a friend of mine who works who is a retired pastor, he knows these stories, but he's also worked in a clinical setting for a lifetime. I said, if you were going to put a psychological evaluation on King Saul, what would it be? He said, bipolar, terribly, and paranoid. And he goes off the deep end. I said, if you're going to put a diagnosis on David, what would it be? He said, unbelievable narcissist. Totally involved in himself. It never says that David loved any of those wives he took. He used them all. And his first wife was a daughter of King Saul. And then there's the gal when he's serving as I'm going blank on her name. She's a younger wife of this guy who won't help David when he's on the run, and he refuses to help, and she secretly sends David a bunch of food and whatnot, and then they get together and they kill the husband, and she moves in with him. And then he does it later with the wife of his bodyguard, Bathsheba. And so David is pulling this stunt all the time. David is totally wrapped up in himself, and he's one of these guys. He's power. Henry Kissinger said one time, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. Everybody wants to be close to David because the scriptures attest, he's extremely handsome, he's charming, he's powerful, and he's the king. And so everybody's figuring a way to get close. When we get to Bathsheba after the first of the year, I will argue Bathsheba knew exactly what she was doing, and she was not an innocent party to this whole thing. She's playing a power game too. So David's not innocent in this whole matter. It's not just with Bathsheba, it's the whole deal. And later kings end up, by the way, later descendants of David end up making alliances with Egypt, which is essentially to go back to Egypt. And the prophets will eventually attack this and say, why are you leaning on this pact you've got with Egypt to face the Babylonians? It's going to fail. And what it just sent shivers through Jerusalem hundreds of years later when the Babylonians came and destroyed the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish, which is not mentioned in the Bible. And then the Babylonians turned on Jerusalem. And Jerusalem had nowhere near the size army that the Egyptians had. So the point is ultimately, in the middle of these human things that we do that seem like a good idea at the time, that are altogether futile, does the Lord still claim us and love us, and is he still there? That's what we're struggling with. Now we have a choice in this matter. I can either get angry and try to make the outside of my world match the way I want it to be on the inside. Or I can learn to be calm and trust that God's got that taken care of, as scared as I am, or angry, or hurt, or wondering where he is, and still be a faithful and responsible operative in the world. That's not easy to do. There are legitimate questions politically about the existence of the state of Israel. Those are legitimate questions. I do not agree with the alternative that somehow it should all be Palestine. But I think what we see getting worked out on the front page of the paper these days is a powerful example of human sin. I mean, and this is just from the standpoint, we operate in this world either by grace or by absolute law and justice. Thank you, Brad, for enforcing that for us. Okay? And thanks to Mark. Did he walk a beat last night? Good. Thank you. And when you've got a group of terrorists who infiltrate what we've, at least legally, is this, and you start assaulting civilians the way that was done, full force of the law. No mercy. None. And that's doing the will of God. I still believe in capital punishment. But I do not believe it should be held at midnight in secret with a few witnesses. I think when somebody has finally gone through all the process and we know you're guilty of this murder, here's the penalty, death. We're going to hang you. We're not going to do it at midnight. We're going to do it at noon in the Pinnacle Bank Arena. And we're closing all the schools, and all the kids are going to be watching. And we're going to hang you until you're dead. And then we're going to turn to the kids and say, you either behave yourself or you're next. That's the law. Sorry. Worked when you were growing up, didn't it? Barb has said on a number of occasions, she saw her mother take out after her brother with a paddle. She never wanted that. Look how nice she is. What's happened, though, is that the state has taken over some of the job of the church. It is not the state's job to forgive sins. It's the state's job to punish sin. It's our job to forgive it. Okay? This started in the 19th century. Doesn't make your job any easier, Brad, or Mark's either. Mark is a patrol officer. Is he a sergeant or?
He's just an officer.
Okay. Where do we go? All right. This week, I encourage that you read 1 Samuel 1 as you get ready for Aaron looking at 1 Samuel 2, which is the song of Hannah, after she has been given the gift of Samuel and brought him to be dedicated. I want you, as you read 1 Samuel, to watch Hannah's husband is named Elkanah, and he has two wives. Hannah is one of them, the other is Peninnah. And it's, by the way, paralleled by Hagar and Sarah and by Leah and Rachel, the contest between the wives. And the husbands end up playing them off against one another. Elkanah, however, lives north of where the Ark of the Covenant is, and it is at Shiloh, which is to the north of Jerusalem. It's in the hill country. Elkanah is extremely devout with his whole family. He comes to the designated 3 festivals a year and brings a sacrifice every time. Very devout and pious. And he's got a family, and he's got typical family issues going on. Jealousy between his 2 wives. The text says very clearly he prefers Hannah to Peninnah. But Peninnah is the one with all the children, the same as Leah was and the same as Hagar, because Hagar taunted Sarah after Ishmael was born. And Leah taunted Rachel. Hannah is bitter. And the question is there in my mind, is she bitter because she has not had a child and yearns for that? Or is she bitter because the way she's treated by her co-wife? Or both at the same time? I don't know. She's just bitter, and her life has been made miserable and disappointing. And she goes and she prays, but she's grumbling and she's bitter. And she's still held up as an example of devotion and trust in God because she's putting her hurt in front of God honestly. I want you to note the ineffectiveness of Eli and his family's abuse of priestly power, because by the time you get into chapter 3 in 2 weeks, it talks about the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. And the practice was at the time that the way the priests, Eli and his family, got paid, people would bring sacrifices, and while the meat was being boiled, they'd stick a fork in there, and whatever came out was a priest. But Hophni and Phinehas went so far as people were bringing their sacrifices of meat before it was even put on the altar. He said, "Give us some of that." And the guy would say, "Wait a minute, let's at least burn the fat because that's a pleasant offering to the Lord." "No, you give it to us now or we'll take it by force. And by the way, give us 10% for the big guy." Little political humor. Very little political. And at the end of chapter 1, you get the birth and the dedication of Samuel. And his name means heard by God, or heard of God, because Hannah's plea and her emptiness and her brokenness, the Lord uses and gives her the gift of Samuel. She makes this promise that she will put him under a Nazirite vow, which means his whole life, no strong drink of any kind and no cutting of his hair, totally dedicated to the Lord. This does not mean he's celibate, because Samuel himself, by the end of chapter 2, has 2 sons, and Samuel, by the end of chapter 2, has had a lifetime of ministry as judge, prophet, and king. He is a prophet, a priest, and a king, and as such, he's a foreshadowing of Jesus. As is Moses, as is King David. You get this piling up of history. But his sons are losers, and they're just like Hophni and Phinehas. And that's when the people come and say, "You're going to die soon, and we need a king," which is exactly what Deuteronomy 17 talked about. Okay. We are at it, and a minute past. Thank you for receiving this. Hope it's helpful this morning. Let's close with prayer. We live in the middle of a very confusing world on our own issues and our families and our relationships, our community. Sometimes, gracious God, you know full well, we love one another here in our congregation, yet we don't always understand or wonder about this thing and that. We struggle to trust in you in the face of our humanity and all the questions of life. We're profoundly concerned about what's going on in the history of the world and in our culture. Receive it all. Reassure our hearts this morning that in the same way you had your hand upon Boaz and Ruth and Eli and Samuel and Saul and David, you are no less present for each of us today in the challenges you've given us. Bless the day that lies before us, and bless the word and sacrament we receive today in Christ. Amen. Aaron's up next week, chapter 2.